A woman from a wealthy family was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, but even some of the best doctors in the city could not figure out what was wrong with her. Eventually, police became involved, and what they uncovered stunned everyone connected to the case. With every new twist, the story began to feel less like real life and more like the plot of a detective novel. While its final outcome drew attention from people across the country, Nancy Lyon was born on August 6, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. She was the youngest of 4 children, with 2 older brothers and a sister. Her father had built a successful career in commercial real estate, so the family was very well off. They lived in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in Dallas, were actively involved in charity, and were highly respected in the community. Growing up, Nancy was quiet and somewhat shy, but she was also an excellent student with ambitious plans for her future. After finishing high school, she attended Hollins College in Roanoke, Virginia, and received a liberal arts degree in 1975. She later chose to specialize in landscape architecture, spending 2 years at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Fine Arts, before moving on to the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where she completed the program in 1981. During her first year at Harvard, Nancy met a man named Richard, and the two began dating. After graduation, they got married and moved back to Dallas, settling near the same upscale neighborhood where Nancy's parents lived. Nancy went to work for one of the largest construction companies in the country at the time, where she quickly began moving up the ranks. She earned a reputation as a talented leader and eventually became the youngest partner in the company's history. 5 years into their marriage, Nancy and Richard welcomed their first daughter, followed by a second 2 years later. By the age of 37, Nancy had built a successful career and a family of her own. It seemed like she had everything she could have dreamed of. Or at least, that was how it looked from the outside. But then, one day, everything changed. On the evening of January 8, 1991, Nancy suddenly became extremely ill. She was suffering from severe stomach pain, and her condition continued to get worse. Richard contacted her doctor, who suspected food poisoning and recommended a medication. He went to the pharmacy, brought it home, and gave it to Nancy, but it didn't help. Richard then took her to the hospital, where she was admitted for further testing. Doctors ran a series of tests, but none of them revealed what was wrong. Even as Nancy's condition deteriorated by the hour, her breathing became erratic, her blood pressure dropped to dangerously low levels. And the following morning, her organs had begun to fail. By then, doctors had begun to suspect that Nancy might have been exposed to some kind of poison, so they ordered additional tests. But her condition was deteriorating too quickly for them to determine the cause in time. Several of her organs began to fail. She lost the ability to breathe on her own and eventually slipped into a coma. The doctors continued doing everything they could to save her, but it soon became clear that she had no chance of recovering. Her family was told that they would have to make the difficult decision to remove her from life support. 6 days after she was admitted to the hospital, Nancy died. Because doctors had been unable to determine what caused her death, her body was sent to the Dallas County Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy. But there was another reason as well. By that point, they were seriously considering the possibility that Nancy had been deliberately poisoned. While she was still conscious, Nancy had told one of the doctors that she believed someone might be poisoning her. According to Nancy, the strange incidents had begun about 4 months earlier, when she found a bottle of expensive wine and an unsigned card on her front porch. Assuming it was a gift from the neighbors, she poured herself a glass and took a few sips. The wine tasted terrible, so she assumed it had gone bad. Later that evening, she developed severe stomach pain. At the time, however, it never crossed her mind that someone might have tried to poison her. Looking back, Nancy remembered that something about the bottle had seemed unusual. It looked as though it might have already been opened. Her symptoms eventually went away. But not long afterward, 2 things happened that made Nancy begin to wonder whether someone was deliberately making her sick, and whether her own husband might be behind it. Back in 1989, several years before Nancy's death, she had discovered that Richard was having an affair. she found bank statements showing that he had been spending large amounts of money on gifts for another woman and on trips they had taken together. Richard initially denied everything, but eventually admitted to the affair. He and Nancy decided to try to save their marriage for the sake of their daughters, and Richard swore he had ended the affair. About a year later, however, Nancy learned that Richard had spent several days away with the same woman, and at that point, she decided their marriage was over. She told Richard to move out and hired an attorney named Mary to begin discussing the details of a divorce. Nancy also restricted Richard's access to their joint accounts because he was continuing to spend large amounts of money on his mistress. Nancy earned considerably more than Richard did, so she was the main source of the family's income. Without access to their shared money, he would not have been able to maintain that kind of spending on his own salary. In September of 1990, Nancy told Richard that she had made a final decision to go through with the divorce. He initially accepted it. But over the next several weeks, the two began discussing whether they should make one last attempt to save their marriage for the sake of their children. They started marriage counseling and gradually began spending more time together. Nancy and Richard went on dates and even traveled out of state with their daughters to visit relatives. By the end of 1990, Richard had moved back into Nancy's home, and the couple ultimately decided not to divorce. They withdrew the paperwork in early January, just a few days before Nancy was hospitalized. By then, however, Nancy had already begun to suspect that Richard might be trying to poison her. She was far from certain and did not want to believe that her husband could be capable of something like that. But one particular incident had made her consider that possibility. It happened after Nancy found the bottle of wine on her porch. Several weeks later, she and Richard went out on a date together as part of their effort to repair the marriage. They had dinner at a restaurant and then went to a movie. At the theater, Richard brought Nancy a cup of soda. But as soon as she took a sip, she noticed a strange taste. When she looked inside the cup, she saw what appeared to be some kind of white powder in her drink. Nancy pointed it out to Richard, but he insisted that nothing was wrong with it and repeatedly tried to convince her to keep drinking. And when she refused, he became visibly angry. Later that night, Nancy became extremely ill once again. It was the first time she seriously wondered whether Richard might have put something. After Richard moved back into the house, Nancy continued experiencing similar episodes, and they gradually became more frequent. She went to several doctors and underwent numerous tests, but no one could determine what was causing her symptoms. Around the same time, Richard began giving her what he described as vitamins, insisting that they would help improve her health. Nancy, however, never saw the bottle or the packaging the capsules had come from. Then, on another evening, while Nancy was already feeling unwell, Richard brought a drink to her bedside. She took several sips. In the middle of the night, she became violently ill again. By this point, Nancy's attorney, Mary, was deeply concerned. She advised Nancy to bring in the bottle of wine and the vitamin capsules so they could be sent to a laboratory for testing. But Nancy was reluctant. She did not want to accuse her husband of trying to poison her, especially without proof. A scandal like that would have been deeply embarrassing to her family, and Nancy had been raised to believe that protecting the family's reputation was extremely important. Still, she had kept both the wine bottle and the capsules, and she told Mary where to find them. As soon as Mary learned that Nancy had been hospitalized and that doctors could not explain her condition, she contacted Nancy's father and told him everything. Nancy was still alive at the time. Her father immediately went to the hospital and asked the doctors to test her for poison. He also brought them the wine bottle and the capsules, which were sent to a laboratory for analysis. Doctors had already submitted samples of Nancy's blood for toxicology testing because she had told them that she believed she was being poisoned. But those tests took time. Nancy did not have time. Her condition continued to deteriorate until she slipped into a coma and died. After her death, 2 separate reports were made to police. One came from Nancy's family after they learned what she had told her attorney. The other came from the doctor Nancy had spoken to shortly before she lost consciousness. The medical examiner performed an autopsy, but could not find any natural illness that explained the sudden failure of Nancy's organs. He would have to wait for the toxicology results. Meanwhile, experts examined the wine bottle and the vitamin capsules. The wine contained no poison, but 2 of the capsules contained barium carbonate, a toxic industrial chemical that was never intended to be consumed. It could have explained some of Nancy's symptoms, but then the toxicology results from Nancy's body came back, and they revealed something even more disturbing. Nancy had not died from barium carbonate. She had died from arsenic poisoning. The concentration of arsenic in her blood was many times higher than normal. The medical examiner concluded that arsenic had damaged her organs and ultimately caused her death. Investigators now faced a strange puzzle. Someone had apparently been giving Nancy poison, but the poison found inside the capsules was not the poison that killed her. So investigators began asking a much bigger question. When had Nancy been exposed to arsenic? And how many times had it happened? Nancy had been getting sick on and off for almost 4 months. Some episodes had been mild, others had been severe. That pattern suggested that someone might have been poisoning her repeatedly rather than giving her one fatal dose. To test the theory, investigators asked a chemistry professor to examine Nancy's hair. The science behind the test was simple. Hair grows outward from the scalp, and certain chemicals can remain trapped inside it. By examining different sections of the hair, researchers could estimate when Nancy had been exposed to arsenic. The results were shocking. They identified at least 3 separate periods of arsenic exposure. The earliest appeared to have occurred roughly 2.5 months before Nancy died. The most recent and strongest exposure appeared to have happened about 2 weeks before her death. That dose did not kill her immediately. Instead, the poison remained inside her body and gradually damaged her organs. Eventually, they began to fail one by one. By the time investigators had all of this information, several weeks had passed since Nancy's death. But one fact was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Before she died, Nancy had already told both her doctor and her attorney that she believed someone was poisoning her. And almost everyone close to her began looking at the same person. The police, however, were careful not to publicly identify Richard as a suspect. They also asked Nancy's family not to tell him that he was under investigation. Detectives waited about a month and a half before questioning him. When Richard finally sat down with investigators, they did not immediately tell him that Nancy's death had been linked to arsenic poisoning. Instead, they began with a simple question. Were there any chemicals around the house that Nancy could have been exposed to? Richard mentioned several products stored in the garage and claimed they were related to controlling insects. Then, during the conversation, he suddenly remembered something important. He admitted that he had ordered several chemicals the previous summer. Among them were arsenic and cyanide. Richard claimed he had purchased them because the property had a serious fire ant problem. He said he never used all of the chemicals and eventually threw them away. Investigators asked if they could search his house and car. Richard agreed. They found no arsenic or other major poisons. At first, that seemed to support his explanation. But detectives were not satisfied. They began examining Richard's financial records and discovered that he had placed multiple orders with a chemical supply company. One order included lithium hydroxide. Another, placed several months later, included barium carbonate. And then, in late November, Richard ordered several different arsenic compounds. The purchase was worth nearly $300. Some of the chemicals were delivered to his workplace. Others were delivered to an apartment Richard had been living in while he and Nancy were preparing for divorce. Investigators went to that apartment and spoke with one of Richard's neighbors. The neighbor remembered accepting several packages for Richard because he was not home. He also remembered that the boxes carried warnings about hazardous chemicals. Police obtained permission to search the apartment. Inside, they found something particularly troubling. There was a bag of empty capsules that could be opened and filled by hand. They also found a bottle of vitamins. The discovery was difficult to ignore. Barium carbonate had been found in capsules Nancy had been taking, and Richard had purchased barium carbonate months earlier. But investigators still needed more. They could not simply arrest someone because the evidence looked suspicious. So, in March, roughly 3 months after Nancy's death, police made the investigation public. They announced that Nancy's death was being treated as a homicide. They also identified Richard as a possible suspect. The story quickly became national news. Nancy had come from a wealthy and respected Dallas family. She had built a successful career, raised 2 daughters, and appeared to have everything. Now police were saying that she may have been slowly poisoned inside her own home, and her husband was the leading suspect. The following day, Richard and his attorney held their own press conference. Richard denied killing Nancy. He insisted that the chemicals he purchased had been intended for insects, but he also offered several alternative explanations for Nancy's death. The first involved Nancy's former employer. Nancy had been expected to testify in a case involving a former boss accused of stealing a large amount of money. After learning that Nancy might testify, she and one of her co-workers received anonymous letters warning them to stay out of the case. Nancy was reportedly frightened by the threats. Investigators questioned her former boss. He denied sending the letters and said he had no reason to kill Nancy. Detectives could not find evidence connecting him to her death. Richard then offered another theory. He suggested that Nancy might have been taking small amounts of arsenic herself. According to him, she may have been trying to make herself sick in the hope that he would feel sorry for her and return to the marriage. And then he accused someone even closer to Nancy, her older brother Bill. Richard claimed Nancy had once told him that Bill had treated her terribly for years. He gave investigators notes that Nancy had supposedly written after therapy sessions. The notes contained disturbing allegations against Bill. Nancy wrote that she was afraid of him and worried that he might hurt her or her daughters. She also claimed that Bill was jealous of her successful career and owed her a large amount of money. When police spoke with Nancy's parents, they admitted that some kind of inappropriate incident had occurred between Nancy and Bill years earlier. But they insisted it had not been as serious as Nancy described. Bill denied the allegations completely. Then investigators received something even stranger: an anonymous letter. The writer claimed to be a hired killer. According to the letter, Bill had paid him to kill Nancy. But the writer claimed Bill had failed to pay him, so he decided to expose the murder. Investigators tried to identify the writer. They found nothing. The letter had been typed, leaving no handwriting to analyze. And once again, the investigation seemed to hit a dead end. Until detectives looked more closely at Nancy's therapy, investigators sent the notes to a handwriting expert. At first, the results seemed ordinary. The entries appeared to have been written in the same handwriting. But then the expert compared them with known samples from Nancy and Richard. That was when something unusual appeared. Nancy and Richard's handwriting looked remarkably similar. Their family explained why. While they were in college, the couple had deliberately learned to imitate each other's handwriting. Nancy sometimes completed important assignments for Richard, and they did not want anyone to realize that someone else had written them. The handwriting expert therefore examined the individual letters very carefully. Eventually, he found subtle differences. Those differences allowed him to distinguish Nancy's handwriting from Richard's. The conclusion was devastating. Nancy had written most of the notes, but the passages accusing Bill had been written by Richard. The man who was trying to convince investigators that Nancy's brother had murdered her had apparently added the accusations himself. 5 months after Nancy's death, Richard was arrested. Prosecutors argued that he had deliberately poisoned his wife over a period of months. They believed he had used different chemicals at different times to make Nancy appear naturally ill. Instead of giving her one obvious fatal dose, they believed he slowly exposed her to poison, creating a pattern of mysterious illnesses. And prosecutors believed they knew why. Money. Nancy earned considerably more than Richard. If they divorced, Richard would lose access to the lifestyle he had enjoyed while married to her. He would also have to deal with child support for their 2 daughters. At the same time, he wanted to continue his relationship with his mistress. Prosecutors argued that this created a powerful motive. By convincing Nancy to stop the divorce and allowing him to move back into the house, Richard regained access to her. And according to the prosecution, that access allowed him to continue poisoning her. There was also a life insurance policy worth approximately $500,000. At the time, Richard stood to benefit from it. But there was another disturbing detail. Richard's mistress told investigators that he had previously claimed Nancy was suffering from a rare blood disorder and probably did not have long to live. The problem was that Nancy had never been diagnosed with such a disorder. And Richard had made that statement months before Nancy became seriously ill. The defense continued to argue that Richard was innocent. His attorneys returned to the same theories he had offered before. They suggested that Nancy might have been killed by her brother, her former boss, or possibly by Nancy herself. To support the suicide theory, Richard claimed he had found an invoice showing that Nancy had purchased chemicals, including arsenic. The document even appeared to contain Nancy's signature. But when the owner of the company named on the invoice testified, the story collapsed. He said his company had never sold the chemicals listed on the document. He also explained that the company's invoices were handwritten and used completely different forms. The document Richard claimed to have found was not genuine. Instead of helping the defense, it gave prosecutors another reason to believe that someone had tried to create false evidence against Nancy. The defense made one final attempt. They called a psychiatrist who had never met Nancy. Based only on conversations with Richard and newspaper reports, the psychiatrist suggested that Nancy might have had psychological problems and could have deliberately poisoned herself to win Richard back. But prosecutors pointed to something much more difficult to explain. When Nancy was dying in the hospital, she told a doctor that she believed someone had poisoned her, and she begged him not to let her die. If Nancy had knowingly taken arsenic herself, prosecutors argued, it made little sense that she would desperately ask doctors to save her while refusing to tell them what poison she had taken. The jury ultimately rejected the defense theories. Richard was found guilty of murdering Nancy. He was sentenced to life in prison and ordered to pay a $10,000 fine. Richard continued to insist that he was innocent. He later tried several times to overturn his conviction. He argued that the case against him was circumstantial and later blamed his attorney for mistakes during the trial. But in 1994, an appeals court ruled that the evidence against him was overwhelming. His conviction remained in place. For decades, Richard continued to deny responsibility. He even contacted organizations that investigate possible wrongful convictions, hoping someone would take another look at his case. But none agreed to represent him. Meanwhile, Nancy's daughters were left without both parents. After Richard's arrest, they were raised by Nancy's family. And there was one final detail that made the story even more tragic. At some point after Nancy began suspecting that Richard was poisoning her, she quietly changed the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. The $500,000 payout would no longer go to Richard. It would go directly to her daughters. So even if Richard had never been convicted, he would not have received the money Nancy believed he might be trying to obtain. Richard eventually became eligible for parole, but his requests were denied. He continued to deny responsibility for Nancy's death. His most recent parole attempt came in 2026, and once again, he was refused release. After more than 3 decades behind bars, Richard remains imprisoned. Nancy's story began with a woman who appeared to have everything: wealth, a successful career, a husband, and 2 daughters. But behind that picture-perfect life was a marriage falling apart, an affair, financial pressure, mysterious illnesses, hidden chemicals, and ultimately, a deadly poisoning. The most disturbing part may be that Nancy herself appears to have sensed what was happening. She was afraid that someone was slowly poisoning her, but before she could prove it, she died. And the investigation that followed uncovered a trail of chemicals, suspicious purchases, secret relationships, and forged evidence that eventually led investigators back to the person closest to her. Richard has never admitted that he killed Nancy. But the jury reached a very different conclusion. And after all these years, he remains behind bars. So what do you think? Was the evidence against Richard enough to prove that he deliberately poisoned his wife? Or do you believe there was still reasonable doubt? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more true crime cases.